Okay, good evening. I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's joint Policy and Accountability Committee budget meeting. My name is Councillor Bora Kwan and I'm going to be chairing the joint committee. Tonight's meeting is slightly different because we're combining the Community Safety and Environment Policy and Accountability Committee along with the Economy, Housing and the Arts Policy and Accountability Committees. So we have a slightly larger group than usual. I would like to remind all the participants of a few housekeeping points. So to all the committee members and people attending the meeting, could you please keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking to avoid any audio feedback? And when prompted, you can indicate you wish to speak, but for the sake of running a organised meeting, I would prefer it if you would address your comments and questions to the chair, which will be myself for the beginning part of the meeting, and then Councillor Vaughan for the second part of the meeting. If you would address all your comments and questions to us and then wait until one of us calls on you before fully speaking. If any councillor needs to leave the meeting or loses connection during an item, we will pause and wait for a few minutes for them to reconnect. Okay, item 1, apologies for absence. As yet, I haven't received any apologies for absence. I believe all the expected members are present. And then I'm now going to move on to the roll call and the declarations of interest. This is to confirm all the members in attendance. I will call on members in alphabetical order, and when called on, if you could please say present, and at that time, if you have any declarations of interest, could you please declare them at that time? However, if you don't have any declarations of interest, you can just say present. I will start first with the members of the Community Safety and Environmental Policy PAC. So, Councillor Brocklebank Fowler.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Cassidy.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Rosenberg.
Present.
Thank you. And joining us for the first time, new member of the committee, Councillor Fiona Smith.
Thank you. Present.
Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the members of Economy, Housing and Arts Policy. Councillor Alford.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Rowbottom.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Vaughan.
Present.
Thank you. I think that might be a typo here. I've got Councillor Rosenberg, but oh, Councillor Rosenberg, apologies, you're on both committees, aren't you? Okay, well, she was Councillor Rosenberg was present for my committee, so I presume she's also present for the Economy, Housing and Arts Committee as well. Okay, just before we go into the first item, Councillor Lisa Homan, who is the Cabinet Member for Housing, would like to make reference to the housing revenue account. Councillor Homan, if you'd like to address the committee.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say that I'm not entirely sure how it happened, but I think it got lost in translation in that when the two committees were combined for this budget, looking at the budget, somehow or another the housing revenue account, which we do normally take a look at, managed to not get onto the agenda. I'm not sure how it happened, but I'd like to just reassure members of the committee that there was a housing representatives forum which was held on the 12th of January, which covered all of our housing reps. I think there were 17 people present. So while some of them would usually attend this particular meeting and maybe ask questions at this particular meeting every year, they have had an opportunity at the housing reps forum and we do have the presentation that was provided there and the minutes of that meeting if anybody would like to see them after this evening's meeting, because obviously there isn't an opportunity to discuss it at the PAC this evening. So I just wanted to make that point clear.
Okay, Councillor Alford is indicating that she would like to speak. Councillor Alford? Councillor Alford, I believe you're on mute at the moment.
Right. Yes, obviously I'm very concerned we haven't got the housing revenue account. Therefore, can I be provided with all the documentation, please?
Yeah, I will make sure that officers provided to Councillor Alford and any other committee members that would like that information as well.
Thank you very much, Councillor Homan. Okay, so I will move on to item 3, which is the 2021 medium-term financial strategy. This is a report which sets out the budget proposals for the services covered by these policy and accountability committees. An update is also provided on any proposed changes in fees and charges in the budget. Now, before they speak, can I just remind officers to introduce themselves when they first address the committee for the benefit also of anyone who's watching via our live stream. So firstly, I'm going to ask Emily Hill to introduce this item. I understand that the officers will be providing a short corporate presentation and then the 2 separate departmental presentations, but Emily Hill will be providing the first main item.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Chair. My name's Emily Hill and I'm the Director of Finance. I'm going to start with a short corporate presentation because I know these 2 committees are more interested particularly in the specific proposals that are being brought forward for the relevant services. But I think it's useful to provide a quick backdrop, and I think the Chair specifically asked me to provide some explanation of the impact of COVID on budget setting this year. So I'll do that from a corporate perspective. Chair, if it's okay, I'll pull up a presentation. Whilst I'm presenting, I won't be able to see any hands up or anything. So I'm happy to either take questions as I go through or at the end, as you'd prefer. But if you did want them to be as I go through, perhaps you'll interrupt me as I speak because I won't be able to see any hands up or anybody wanting to speak.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll keep an eye if anyone can use the hands up function, but otherwise, if possible, if you could leave questions to the end, I think that will probably be the easiest. But if something urgent does come up, then please do use the raise hand function.
Thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen and please let me know if you can't see it. Or if you can see it even. Has it arrived on your screens yet?
It's arrived
Yes.
on mine.
You've got it,
Yes.
Emily.
Excellent. Thank you. OK, so I think before we started this financial year 2021, so as the current financial year that we're in, we were rather hopeful, I think, that we were sort of coming to the end of austerity. Central government talks about local government's core spending power, and that means the revenue resources that are available to local government to provide its services. And we had seen over the past 5 years, since 2017-18, increases in what government called core spending power, so resources available to government. And in the last year, 2021, a 5.1% increase. This year, again, government have proposed a 4.5% increase in core spending power, so 4.5% more revenue resources available to local government. But perhaps I'll come back to that in a little while to explain better the breakdown of that. But even though we've had increases over the past 5 years, we had significant and deep cuts between 2010 and 2016. So although we thought we were coming out of austerity, as it were, all of those increases in funding had still meant that local government was still worse off in both cash and real terms compared to 2010-11. So we're working with less resources than we did 10 years ago now, less or fewer. So the result of that was exactly this picture you see. We've been making more savings than we have been providing in growth for demographic changes and other priorities each year. So you can see in each year the savings being more than the growth, slightly less in this year, and again in 2021 the savings exceeding the growth. So gradually our budgets were and are reducing. And that really shows in the financial pressures that were experienced by the council and local government more widely. And slowly again, our reserves balances are reducing. I'll just explain here that you see a very, very minor increase here in that last financial year. And that's explained largely due to the timing of the COVID-19 grant, in that we received £7 million right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic in March to apply to COVID expenditure in the following year. So essentially we hold money here that we received in grant to spend, in fact, when the biggest hit of COVID-19 hit in 21-22. So this is in your paper, so I don't expect to go through it in any detail, but it's how we received, how we changed last year's budget to this year's budget. We need to make provision for inflation, growth pressures and priorities. This year, and I'll come on to this a bit more in detail, we've made some provision for COVID-19 and then any other movements such as contributions to reserves and levels of increased borrowing. That, of course, needs to be net off by savings, and this means we need to find 7.8 million and have identified 7.8 million of savings in order to balance the budget, that we live within the resources that we have available for this financial year. This again is in your pack, and you will be interested particularly in these lines, and I'm sure you'll be asking questions of other officers later on this evening. So just going on to COVID-19, I think as we set last year's budget, we did point to a number of uncertainties and risks in relation to the budget. What we didn't, however, expect was the COVID-19 pandemic, and so there was no provision in the 2021 budget for COVID-19 because the pandemic hit following that. But we have been monitoring it throughout the year. So in terms of 2021, we do know, I think, that we don't think things will be back to normal as we hit the 1st of April 21-22, so the next financial year. And the government too expects that. So it has said that it will give us, it's essentially said it will provide us sort of a quarter's worth, the first quarter's worth of funding that it then expects to be back to some kind of normality. It said it will keep that under review. But at the moment, we've been confirmed a 6.2 allocation of emergency grant, and we have essentially assumed that grant will be used to fund the increased costs that we need to incur to meet additional COVID pressures. Now, that's really difficult to currently guess. It will depend on the nature of continued lockdown and restrictions, and any responsibilities that we're expected to undertake in supporting the government during the pandemic. There is currently a fees and charges compensation scheme, and that will continue for the first quarter. Now, that just to note really that fees and charges compensation scheme doesn't fund us completely for lost fees and charges. There are a number of percentages first that we need to pick up before that government compensation scheme kicks in, and then it will only kick in at 75p in the pound. Similarly, the government has said it will compensate us for 19-20-21 losses on the collection fund. Due to the, I guess, vagaries of local government finance, collection fund losses that are made in one year, so this financial year that we're in, are then spread over, are then recovered the next year. So rather than in the year they are, the government have actually said we need to spread those over 3 years to smooth, I think, any particular impact that would have on council tax, and has funded 75% of that, leaving local government, local councils to fund the 25% themselves over the next 3 years. Sadly, as a result of the downturn in the economy and also the restrictions, we do expect very significant reductions in business rates income, and the London business rates pool has not continued this year because into 21-22 because of the level of risk on that business rates income. And what we know is, after all of this funding is taken into account and after we've incurred the expenditure that we need to incur, any shortfall in government funding will essentially need to be met from reserves or additional in-year savings. And as well as that sort of pure COVID-19 income and expenditure, we also know that the impact of a wider economic downturn has a greater demand for a number of our services. So what's our response, and what will you see in the budget in relation to COVID-19? Well, you'll see a bigger gap where we need to fund the 2021 council tax losses. You'll see a lower income expected from council tax because we expect our ability to collect council tax to worsen due to the pressures really on our residents, the financial pressures. And we've also increased the number of residents that we expect will claim council tax support. So again, less council tax income that we would expect this year. We have modelled business rates income at the safety net level, so the level that the government will guarantee. We don't believe that we will collect more than that minimum. And we've provided, as you've seen in the papers, budget growth for some particular areas that which we think which will face immediate budget pressures because of the COVID pandemic. And because of the level of risk, a specific contingency budget for COVID-19. Because of that increased level of risk, we're also saying we need to increase our general fund balance from 19 million to 20 because there are increasing financial risks. And whilst we've done our absolute best to make prudent assumptions, we don't know what exactly is going to happen in relation to COVID-19 in 21-22, and therefore wherever we haven't made enough sufficient provision in these assumptions, any final balance will need to be met from reserves with an impact in future years of needing to repay those reserves. I talked earlier on about core spending power and how the government announcements and the headlines have been that there's been an increase in core spending power in the resources available for local government of 4.5%. As you can see here, it equates to about 4% in Hammersmith and Fulham, but it includes quite a lot of swings and roundabouts here. So you can see we've got 2 million of additional social care grant, a new grant called the lower tier services grant, but then we've had a significant loss in new homes bonus grant, which was a big grant funding stream for us. What's I think important to say is when government talks about the increase in spending power of 4.5%, what it does is it includes in there an expectation that local government will increase adult social care precept of 3% and 2% for council tax. So if you were to take those local taxes from the spending review calculation, you would find that essentially most of the increase in that spending power is to be raised through local taxes. The other grants often sort of netting each other off. And so I stand here today, I think, even more uncertain about the future for local government finance. We do have the particular risk in the next 12 months of COVID-19, but we have significant additional risks as well that makes it very difficult to sort of forecast going forward. We have the spending review this year, and we need to consider the impact of the additional spending that the government has made during COVID-19 and how it is going to finance that. Will it finance that through increased taxes, or will it finance that through further austerity and public finance reductions? That's yet to be seen, but there is a possibility that we need to go through another round, essentially, that we've seen since 2009-10 of significant funding reductions again to balance the government's books. I mentioned earlier we had a significant reduction in new homes bonus grant. We're concerned will continue. There is a risk around the government's levelling up agenda that means that money may move from London boroughs and other areas or income streams that we are reliant on to potentially other areas. And that's similarly reflected in a potential fair funding review, which we have been expecting, but has been put back, particularly because of COVID. Similarly, long-standing expectations of a change in the business rate system, which is another funding source of local government, and a long-awaited proposal of reform of adult social care, which clearly again is another significant area of spending. Strangely, in this financial year, there has been no announcements of increased funding in public health. And although there is meant to be a fundamental review, the intentions on that are currently uncertain. So we've made very best provisions and estimates in our 2021-22 budgets. When we look further forward, we believe there are still quite significant risks going forward as well. And you'll see that in some of the papers and the medium-term strategy that we've included there, which I think brings me to the end of a sort of corporate overview. And I'm happy, Chair, to answer any questions before moving on to the departmental slides or waiting till the end. Oh, I'm sorry, Chair, I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I have got one question here that I'll take that now, if that's okay with you. Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler. Councillor, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Chairman. If we could just go back to the reserves and balances chart, which the bar chart at the very beginning of the presentation. I wonder if you could explain as clearly and simply as possible what the earmarked reserves and the restricted reserves covers.
I can. Let me just try to pull that slide back up for you, Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler. Oh no, I don't think you can see it.
Thank you. That's the
okay.
Yeah,
great.
That's the one.
So yes, you're correct. The darker blue colour at the bottom is the general balance. So we sort of say that's the very minimum that we need to manage risk. And as I mentioned, I believe that we need to increase that this year, given the increased levels of risk. Earmarked reserves then are reserves that have been earmarked for very particular purposes. So one of the examples of that would be the Civic Campus Reserve, where reserves have been earmarked for the Civic Campus scheme. Other restricted reserves are there, for example, where we have received a grant. So I gave the example of the COVID grant. We might receive a grant in one financial year, but yet the terms and the expenditure that matches that grant haven't been met yet. So until we actually incur that expenditure, we need to keep it in reserves, and then we apply it to that expenditure at that point. So restricted reserves would include grant reserves. Other things that it will include is, for example, our insurance reserve, where we hold reserves for insurance claims and other things. We do have, and it will be, and in fact have been published in the Cabinet report, there is a reserve strategy in the Cabinet budget report, and that does set out actually all of those earmarked reserves on a line-by-line basis that will be available if that's useful to you, and I can forward you the link for that.
Yes, I'd be very grateful for that. Do you think you could arrange for a hard copy to be sent to me?
I'm sure we can.
Thank you.
I'll liaise with committee services definitely to do that.
Thank you very much indeed.
I don't see any hands up for any further questions, but if there is any other councillor who had a general comment for Emily, who has been unable to use the hands up function, then please speak. No, I just wanted to say it must be incredibly difficult, and I don't really understand how it's possible to make the budget when the opening up of the economy at the moment just seems to be so uncertain. How do you actually forecast the sort of managing that? Because I think I imagine that when this was when you and your team were sort of planning the budget for the coming year, there was a sort of question mark, there was a pencil for the economy opening up, or at least restrictions somewhat being lifted from around February, March. That looks like it's actually an early estimate at the moment. Have you been able to mitigate for that in your allowances and forecast for the year, or will there be, is there enough sort of leeway in the numbers to actually look at later in the year if that ends up being the case?
Thank you. Yes, I think there's sort of two answers to that. I think one of the biggest risks to local government financing is the business rates number that comes in, and that the business rates payable is hit very hard by the current coronavirus restrictions. In relation to Hammersmith and Fulham, what we've done is we've forecast, we've based our budget on the safety net, on the minimum amount that government will guarantee that we receive. So that provides us with a little bit more security in relation to that than we might otherwise. So that's one form of income. You're quite right, though, that the level of restrictions are probably impossible actually to forecast, and similarly the expenditure that the council may need to incur may change quite dramatically depending on the role that central government would like local government to take. So if local government were to have a large role in the vaccination programme, then we would incur additional costs. So actually what we've had to do is we've based a budget on our best guess of the very specific sort of demand factors that will come in, and we see 2.7 million of growth in relation to additional demand for services. And on the other side, in terms of other types of increased expenditure, we are having to make an assumption that the additional government funding that has been allocated to us will meet those additional costs. So we've made that as a base assumption, but because we know that we haven't been fully funded for our costs this year, and in fact at the moment we're looking at a 2.5 million underfunding essentially for this financial year, we have got a COVID contingency that we've added into the budget of 1.1 million, so half of that loss that we've made this year, because we would hope that after about sort of 6 months into the new financial year, things will start to normalise, perhaps. But there is a significant level of risk in there. So we've done our best by increasing contingency and ensuring where possible we have put any money that we do receive from one-off savings into reserves to give our reserves a buffer to pick up any additional costs of COVID that we'd need to fund.
Okay, it looks like there's a lot of things written in pencil at the moment. Thank you. Councillor Rowbottom, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Chair. It was largely covered in Emily's previous answer. It was just around, you know, the 75% that was being met by the government and therefore 25% shortfall spread over 3 years. But I think you've kind of alluded to the fact that you put some mitigation in place there, and I'm assuming there's not a lot more to say on how that would be met at this stage.
No, so what we have done is that's in terms of the council tax loss in that 75%, we've factored that loss into our budget gap, so we've had to identify savings to meet that gap. In terms of the other fees and charges income, Councillor Rowbottom, you're absolutely right. We would need to meet that from the contingency sums that we've set aside, or alternatively from reserves.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, if there aren't any further questions or comments, which I can't see, we will then, we're going to move on now to the departmental presentations. Thank you, Emily. I'm going to ask, we're going to start with the Community Safety and Environment departmental presentation. If I can ask the officers who will be doing the presentation to start, and also to just introduce themselves to the committee and for the benefit of anyone watching on the live stream. I have that we have Sukhvinder Kelsey, Head of Finance for the Environment, to start.
If I may, Chair, it's Sharon Lee.
Oh, Sharon, yes.
Yes. Good evening, Chair. Good evening, committee. So I'm Sharon Lee, and I am the Strategic Director for the Environment, and my colleagues at Vinder Kelsey and I are doing this presentation together, and then we can take any questions, Chair, if that's okay with you. So, Satvinder, are you able to put the presentation up, please? Thanks, Satvinder. That's lovely. So great. So if you go to slide 1, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much. So, Chair, as this slide says, sorry? Is that Councillor?
Yeah, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I can't see anything on the screen.
The presentation is up. Can other members see it? Councillor Kwan?
I can see it.
I can.
So can I?
I can see it, yeah.
I wonder whether
It's just
to do
me.
it's through the device. Councillor Brockabouter-Fowler, are you able, if we email you the slides, do you have another device like a computer or a phone that you could actually see that on?
No, I'm using my own iPad, but it was fine for the previous presentation. But I just got, I haven't got anything.
Chair, I will talk through all the bullet points. So, and perhaps then we can deal with this afterwards. But I will, Councillor Brockabouter-Fowler, I will go through every bullet point in a bit more detail since you can't see.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps if we can arrange for the actual presentation slides themselves also to be emailed to Councillor Brockabouter-Fowler so after the meeting, so she knows what we all saw.
That would be great. We'll do that, Chair. Thank you very much. Thank you. Chair, the first point is that the Environment Department is responsible for a wide range of universal and statutory services. And of course, those services do actually support the delivery of the council's key values and priorities. So taking pride in Hammersmith and Fulham and building shared prosperity does require high standards of delivery, whether that be in a well-maintained and attractive public realm, like parks and open spaces, or ensuring strong regulatory services such as environmental health and food safety, noise nuisance, pest control, etc. In supporting residents as a compassionate council, the department's Resident Services Division does have a key role in tackling inequality and treating residents with respect and dignity when they come to the council for help, and supporting them to overcome disadvantage when they're experiencing financial hardship in terms of helping them with benefit supports, etc. Our department does things with residents. We try and embrace and support this value by involving residents in services, and we have recently hosted 3 very important and influential resident commissions. Finally, while we're all here tonight, the reason for our being here tonight is our report does mention a number of initiatives to help reduce cost and to cover costs by raising income. And we do this, our approach to doing this in the Environment Department is we hold a monthly finance and performance board where we examine all expenditure, all income and how we're managing debt. And our staff are all accountable for their budgets and managing within cash limits. Next slide, please, Satvinder. So this slide, Chair, just shows a few examples of major projects that we've delivered or are ongoing in the department. So a very important one was the Environment Department had shared services with Kensington and Chelsea. We no longer have shared services. For all of this year now, we've been operating as sovereign services. The project was called Move On To, and that actually was delivered at no extra cost to Hammersmith and Fulham residents, but actually gives more accountability to H&F members. So we're very, very pleased with that project. In addition, we've improved the performance and reduced the cost of a number of our contracts, and very important contracts to residents, like the waste collection and street cleansing contract. We have also increased income to the council from the leisure services contract. And in addition, with the waste contract, not only did we reduce costs, but we were able to get more performance indicators from the contract. And where those performances aren't met, there are some financial penalties, which we're very pleased to have achieved. So in terms of other service improvements, we've obviously been looking at management costs and restructurings and redesign. And in resident services area, we have a new residents access programme. We have reduced costs in highways and transportation with some redesigns, and also in parks and events. Yet we've also managed to achieve at the same time some service improvements, like we have more green flags for parks now than we had previously, whilst also reducing our costs of the service. A very important project for us is the food waste and wheelie bin trial. And our aims there were obviously about trying to tackle climate change by increasing recycling. But for this committee, it's very important to note that we will also be aiming here to reduce the very expensive costs of residual waste. So increasing recycling, which is cheaper for us to dispose of, whilst reducing residual waste, and of course eradicating the use of plastic bags as part of our waste stream. So that's really important. And I think all of the changes that we've tried to deliver in environment, we have been exploring the use of digital and automation of services so that we could keep that really good contact with residents, but at the same time, behind the scenes, we're looking to improve services by improved digital and automation. Move on, Satvinder, thank you. I think the department can claim that it has a strong financial performance. Last year, we had a number of historical savings targets that the department had carried with it for a number of years. And we actually balanced our budget last year within 1.1%, which was quite a good achievement in view of the challenges that we had with a number of major projects. This year, it was my absolute hope to deliver a balanced budget COVID may have got in the way of that. However, if the government does give the council, allows us to claim for all the COVID impacts, then I believe we will not just balance, but we may actually get in under budget for this year. Another important note, I think, for members is that we do actually generate a significant income for chargeable services. These are there to actually cover costs, but they're important nevertheless. And of course, resident services, it deals with contact with residents, but it also is very vital because we collect council tax and business rates, but we also support our most vulnerable residents in the timely payment of housing and council tax benefits. And this year, Chair, very importantly, those staff have been working round the clock to deliver a myriad of COVID-related grants. So very, very important. Satvinder, just would you carry on now with these? Thank you.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Sharon. Good evening to all members of the committee. So my intention in the next 5 minutes or so is to go through a few slides to share with you some of the finances and the budgets for the services that Sharon has just explained. Say a little bit about how the budget has changed year on year. Some comments about what key outcomes the budget for this year and the proposed for next year will deliver, and also reflect on some of our concerns moving forward into future years. So the first slide just sets out a little table that explains in broad terms the gross expenditure on our services and the income and the net budget. And Sharon explained all the wide range of services that we deliver. So they're set out here in 4 major departments: public health, safer neighbourhoods, leisure, sport and culture, and resident services. And the table explains the kind of gross expenditure and the income and the net budget. We've of course got the parking services as well, so they're detailed at the bottom of that slide. Just by way of a bit more detail, out of our total spend of £98 million or so, 25 million relates to our employees that we have in the department. That's about 500 staff in total, and about 25 million is spent on the major contracts that Sharon talked about earlier: the waste collection, the street cleaning, the grounds maintenance contracts, amongst 1 or 2 other ones overall. In terms of the key budget changes for the Environment Department, the department, as Sharon explained, delivers a number of very, very important universal services to all residents of the borough. So our budget, this table just basically shows the changes year on year and links in to what Emily was saying earlier about the savings overall in the budget, the investment that's going in, and the resources overall. So the department has got £700,000 worth of savings to deliver next year, and the details are all attached in the report and the appendices. So I won't go through them here fully, but happy to take any questions from members later. We've allowed for some contractual inflation on our external contractors, but we're expecting very much that our contractors and partners will work with us to absorb some of that inflation, given the very difficult times that we are operating in that Emily talked about earlier. I'm pleased to say that new investment, almost 1 million, will be made into the department to provide some of the services that members have set aside as being very important, and I'll say a couple of words about that in a moment. We're using Greater Public Health Grant to fund some of our services overall, £500,000 increase for the current year. And there's some minor other changes overall, which results in a net budget of almost 67.9 million compared to 67.4 million for the last year. And therefore, that's an increase of about £500,000. And the parking services, we're expecting there to be efficiencies overall in the way that the services are delivered, operational costs, and 400,000 has been put into the service there to result in a net 26.1 budget for next year overall. So if I say just a few words about the key budget investments and outcomes from the current proposals and the budget for 21-22, I think we're going to be now looking forward to some major changes. We've got a new neighbourhood enforcement team that has been established. The council will be investing almost 4.6 million in that new service, and it will be up and running from April onwards. Staff of almost 70 people within the team. We have established also a climate change team to deliver the very, very long-term ambitions that the council has on that particular agenda. £500,000 has gone in to set up a team of about 9 staff who will take that agenda forward. There is some additional investment in emergency planning and CCT services, very important in the current climate that we're operating. About 150,000 has gone into those services. And Sharon mentioned earlier that we are working very hard to reduce the cost of some of our existing services. So we're reducing marginally some of the costs of our new highways team, amongst other teams overall. More importantly, we're proposing a freeze on all our fees and charges next year. And I'd like to say just a couple of words about that. I think our residents and our businesses are suffering enormously with the economic damage being caused by the pandemic overall. And we want to try to protect them as best as we can, because we've seen significant reductions in our income in the current financial year. But that's not to say we're not going to take those forward in the future. But for next year, we're proposing a freeze on all those. And I mentioned earlier that there's an expectation that our external service providers will generate some efficiencies to partially offset some of the cost inflation pressures that we will face, working in partnership with them to make that work for the benefit of our residents. And finally, we'll be making sure that obviously all the claims that we can make from national government about the additional COVID-related grants that Emily explained earlier, that's very important for us to offset our costs wherever possible overall. So in summary, that was a key summary of some of the investments and outcomes from our budget proposals for next year. Finally, then, just to say a couple of words about the future, the medium term, about 18 months, 12 to 18 months. There are some things, obviously, that we will be focusing on. We are continuing to be concerned about the pressures on our services and income from the continuing COVID pandemic. So that's going to be something that we will need to manage and monitor and minimize the financial impact wherever we can. We are also very concerned about the continued closure of Hammersmith Bridge, and we're waiting for government confirmation of funding for the restoration of that particular programme. Certainly the residents of Hammersmith and Fulham cannot be expected to bear unsustainable burdens in that regard. We're seeing pressures on our funding from external organisations, particularly TfL, which rely on resources for some of our highways work. So we're worried about the impacts that's going to have over the medium term. And also we will be looking forward in the next 24 months or so to the reprocurement of some of our major external services. The waste collection contract that Sharon referred to earlier and the street cleaning contract will be due to be renegotiated from January 23. We've got our grounds maintenance contracts, amongst others. And we've got to make sure that all the key programs and projects that we are working on are delivered effectively and efficiently, in particular the resident engagement and access program that we'll be dealing with over the next 18 months or so. Members, that was a summary in brief terms about our finances overall in the Environment Department, some of the key outcomes of our budget and some of the issues that we're worried and looking at for the future overall. I think that's the end of our presentation, Sharon.
Thank you, Sukhvinder. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, many thanks to Sharon, Sukhvinder and everyone on your teams. I think providing services and maintaining that level during the pandemic recently must have been incredibly difficult, and I've had some sort of quite good feedback from residents that there doesn't seem to have been a significant drop. However, firstly, I'm going to ask members, as chair of the Community Safety Environment PAC, I'm going to ask members of that PAC to ask questions about the report to the officers or the cabinet members and to make any comments now. So if you can either use the raise hand function, or if that's not possible, indicate to me on your screen and I'll try and come to you. I have Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm afraid I do feel at a distinct disadvantage, having not been able to actually see the presentation. I don't quite understand why I could see the first one and not this latest one. But nevertheless, given that we've had the pandemic this year, can you explain from a financial point of view why the recycling scheme was rolled out without proper consultation of those who received it, and the expenses involved in providing new bins for every dwelling in the scheme, and the expenses of the contract for the new lorries with the lifting equipment.
Chair, if I may, Satvinder will come in on the latter part of that question, but if I may just respond to Councillor Brocklebrant-Fowler with the first part of the question, which is why did we go ahead with the trial? The trial was planned, had been planned for some time. In fact, when we delivered the savings and improvements to the waste and street cleansing contract many months ago, we did discuss with Serco the possibility of doing a trial. The reason we're doing a trial is because most of the councils nationally do operate with a wheelie bin system now of collection. Chair, it is much safer for the operatives. Plastic bags contain glass, they contain needles, they give the workforce back injuries. So that's one issue, which is about the health and safety of the crews. The wheelie bins are cleaner for the environment, so they tend to have a good impact on your street cleaning costs. The other thing about containerisation is that the wheelie bins, you tend to have a smaller bin for your residual and a larger bin for your recycling. So that encourages residents to do more recycling. And other councils up and down the country who've been using this method of collection for many, many years have proven with much higher levels of recycling why it's important to modernise our SAP collection system. But we are a council that does things with residents, and so therefore our number one priority was not to take a service that's operating elsewhere extremely well, that's extremely financially efficient and good for the environment. What we have done is we have done a prototype service to gauge whether the residents of Hammersmith and Fulham would embrace this new type of service delivery. And so just a small number of properties across the borough were selected as being properties and roads that would lend themselves towards being part of the prototype. Obviously, Chair, although there was quite a lot of interaction with residents over the course of the prototype trial, and that still goes on, we did encounter some challenges once we had the COVID pandemic. And we did obviously have to make a choice about that, but we felt with the electronic communication, with the letters that were delivered, that we would still be able to do a trial that we could then judge with our residents whether it was the most suitable method of collection in the future for Hammersmith and Fulham. And early indications are that we are one of the lowest recyclers in the country in terms of at the moment, with between 24 and 26%. But in the trial, we have achieved at times 48% recycling. Now, every 1% of recycling that we as a whole borough are able to deliver does reduce our disposal costs by 70k, 1% increase in recycling as a borough. So hence, it was quite a compelling issue for the borough to see whether it could run this trial safely for the staff involved, safely for the residents, but also achieving the outcomes. It is a trial. It's a prototype. No decisions have yet been made, Chair, about whether this will continue. That is for residents and members to decide. So I hope that helps. And Satvinder, if you don't mind coming back in on some of the costs and that Councillor Brocklebrant-Fowler has mentioned. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. So perhaps I should start by just saying that the current waste collection and street cleaning contract is worth about 11.5 million with Serco. The contract that Sharon and her team negotiated for the start of this financial year delivered a £700,000 saving on that contract, about 9%, for the duration to the end of the extension to January 23. So that number of 700,000 is important in the context of the costs, which I'll say in a moment. In addition, we've secured some KPIs in the contract, which will ensure that the contractors deliver the service that they've set out. The contractors are also investing £500,000 of their own resources to convert our existing refuse collection vehicles to be carbon friendly and efficient overall. Now, turning to the costs overall and the expenditure incurred, the bins that we bought for the pilot areas for the residents, and remember there's 2 bins for each resident, were less than £200,000. The average bin, we secured a very competitive price of £18 a recycling bin. And from a previous experience elsewhere, that's a very, very good price overall. In terms of the service itself, again, the council was able to secure a very, very good deal with Serco. The new service is going to cost less than £200,000 for a full year overall. And finally, on the vehicles, I mentioned earlier that Serco will be investing £500,000 of their own resources to convert some of our existing refuse collection vehicles. We've bought a fleet of about 8 or 9 new electric vans, and that's cost us about £170,000 or so. So the 3 components of our costs are less still than the £700,000 worth of savings that we've made overall on the contract. Chair, I'm stopping there. If there's anything else, please let me know.
Thank you both very much for that. What I find interesting still is that apparently the refuse collectors themselves were not asked whether they thought this was a good idea by Serco. So that's one question. So they, who actually do the job, were not consulted. The residents chosen an interesting mix throughout the borough. However, the food recycling has been, as far as I'm aware, generally welcomed as a trial. But the size of these bins, given the size of the properties, the levels of the front windows, mean that when something is a house is split into 2, which is very common, you have 4 bins filling up the entire front garden where people do like to store bicycles and not look out on dustbins. And it just strikes me that it wasn't thought through enough. And I think that's such a shame when the whole point is to encourage recycling. And I am absolutely passionate about recycling. But nevertheless, I don't feel that this can work throughout the borough. I don't feel that the refuse collectors will be able to swap lorries and do different houses and flats and so on and so forth. The clear recycle bags, actually, I thought, were the most efficient way of doing things.
Councillor.
Yes, so I'm asking a question, in fact, to Councillor Harcourt on this point. As to what were the thoughts that went through his head when he was... Okay,
Councillor Fowler, I appreciate you asking a question. It does stray beyond, I think, the budget element, your follow-up question. I'm going to allow Councillor Harcourt to just give a brief answer, but I think the detail of this really needs to come to a wider pack. We originally obviously were going to address the consultation on the pilot scheme because of the change in the arrangements of the meeting that hasn't been allowed. But I think that as we've got a whole other report to listen to for the other pack. Councillor Harcourt, if you could give a brief answer, if we could then follow up via email, Councillor Brockbart-Fowler, with more detailed questions about the process. And I think the waste pilot scheme is due to come up in our next community safety environment normal full pack anyway. So that's where we need to look at it. But we bear in mind that tonight is about the budget. Okay, so Councillor Harcourt, do you just want to give a brief answer, and then, as I say, the detail I think we will need to follow up either via email or in our following pack.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I will. I mean, so this particular topic did come up at Council last week, in fact, and I answered some of the points that Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler is talking about at that meeting. I think the first thing really is that what was going through my mind in doing this was, A, we've declared a climate emergency. We needed to increase recycling and the improvements to the environment. Secondly, obviously, in terms of this particular pack, there's the cost and cost savings. You've heard from Sukhvinder how much that's saving. And also, we needed to get ourselves, if we're claiming to be such a green borough, then we needed to improve our recycling rates. Now, in doing this particular pilot, I think you heard Sharon Lee saying that just 1% of recycling saves us as a borough £70,000 alone. Now, the simple fact of the matter is that in those areas where we've been trialling this particular scheme, recycling has gone up from around about 23 or 24%, where it's been plateaued for the last half dozen years or so, to 40 up to 48% in some cases. That is a significant increase in that, and the savings, which is what we're talking about here at a budget meeting, are therefore, as a consequence, incredibly high. Now, whether we roll this out across the borough or not is to be decided, because you know, there's a number of issues which are better discussed at the next PAC meeting, where we can look at the more general issues. But you know, I think the important thing here was the savings. Now, there's another area of savings as well, because one of the key issues, one of the key drivers, was the street cleaning. And one of the things that's the problem with that was, with black bags being put out, there were birds, foxes, cats, etc., ripping them open, and mess. The wind, which we've had recently, has blown bags into the street. Cars drive over it. You end up with increased levels of street cleaning. This has actually enabled us to reduce that and keep the service going on other areas. And we haven't seen any reduction in either our street cleaning services or our waste reduction services during the whole of this COVID pandemic. So that's as much as I need to say, I think, on this at the moment. If there's other questions on the scheme in terms of consultation, in terms of delivery and all the rest of it, then, and the policy side of it, I'm quite happy to deal with that at the next meeting, at the next PAC meeting, when it can be an item on the agenda.
Thank you very much. Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler, you're indicating you'd like to speak. If I could just ask you to make that as a final comment, and just keep your question, if it's a question, something related to the budget element.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Different topic. Okay, I was interested in the finance that has been received by the council from the new South Fulham traffic cameras. I'd like to know the figures for that, please.
Is that a question that's best for Sharon or for Sukhvinder?
I wouldn't know.
No, I'm gonna if one of those two officers could.
Chair,
yeah.
I'm sorry, but we don't have those figures in this report. We have a lot of costs that we're incurring to trial those schemes, and I have not yet been briefed on the income that's resulted, because we, as I say, it's a trial and there are costs involved, and so I'm sorry, we can take that question outside of the meeting if that helps, Chair, and respond to Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler separately, but I don't have them here at the moment. Sorry about that.
Okay, Councillor Rosenberg, you had your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
No, I'll wait for the PAC meeting.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further members of the environment? Oh yes, Councillor Casti.
Hi there, thanks very much. I just had a few questions about some of the statements on page 35 with regards to equalities impact assessments. I'm a little bit concerned that from page 35, there's the environment savings that goes through sort of various savings and various kind of changes in expenditure, and all of them please impact. I mean, is that really the case? And what kind of a quality impact assessment are we doing? I mean, the first one is one that seems quite interesting. For example, realignment of the reactive footway repair services. Not, perhaps not necessarily obvious, but I would have thought that changes as to how we are funding the repair of our footways, whether it's a move from reactive funding to kind of funding to make sure that we're sort of dealing with things in advance, is going to have a fairly big impact on some people in the borough, in the sense that from the point of view of casework, whenever somebody has mentioned issues to do with the quality of the pavement, whether it's been loose slabs or something, they're almost always older residents. They're very likely to be disabled residents. I'm surprised that this has a neutral equalities impact, in that it seems to me that anything that changes how we manage our footways and look after them could have quite a big impact on a number of residents. And that seems to apply to a few of the things there. Again, intelligent street lighting, not necessarily obvious how it might have an impact, but better street lighting will have an impact on certain groups that perhaps at the moment feel more vulnerable walking at night in certain parts of the borough. I am just slightly surprised that almost all of these come up as having no equalities impact or a neutral equalities impact. I mean, is that really the case? Or should we be perhaps maybe investigating these a little bit more when we're looking into these changes in the expenditures?
Chair, may I respond? Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Cassidy, for that question and observation. I think it's very well made. And I think what happens here is people are looking at the issue of finance, and they aren't looking at these issues in the round. And I am very, very interested in this area myself. And so what I've asked my colleagues in the department to do is to do a review of equality impact assessments together with our colleagues in the co-production team. So we are having some training and development with that team, and we are now working more closely with them. I think that will make a change to how these equality impact assessments are put together. It will certainly raise their profile, but in relation to the public realm, you're absolutely spot on. Any physical changes that impact on residents, perhaps disabled people or people with walking difficulties, sight or hearing impairments, all very, very important for us to acknowledge. So you're a bit ahead of us there, Councillor Cassidy. Can I just say this is work in progress, Chair, and it's something that's very much on my radar. And I thank you very much for raising it, Councillor Cassidy. We can keep you informed of our progress on that, but I do hope that when you're looking at this report next year, you will be seeing something quite different.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful and very positive to hear.
Thank you. Councillor Schmidt, you've got your hand up. Did you want to make a comment on the questions or the report?
Yeah, also just to provide some more assurances to Councillor Cassidy. So we do a quality impact assessment for the whole budget, of which this is the section relating to what this PAC is speaking about. But also when individual budget items are actually implemented, they normally have their own cabinet reports and a much more in-depth qualities impact assessment, which would go into detail on the types of issues you describe. Obviously, the whole budget has a lot of savings, but it's always subject to further decision-making processes that then will have much more detailed looks at those things. But in general, I think one thing I would say, when you say you're surprised that about them having neutral impacts, this budget, along with all the budgets we've set ourselves the goal of not doing anything that will adversely impact residents. Every single saving we're proposing with the view of not resulting in a worse service. So the example that you raised, we're not saying that we're going to have worse standards for repair of pavements. What we're saying is that we're going to intervene early and try and stop them falling into disrepair in the first place. So using capital budgets to prevent rather than reactive budgets. So even if you did a much more in-depth look at the equalities impact of that, I mean, the goal of it is really to stop pavements getting into a state when you would need reactive repair, when somebody would be impacted. So hopefully that won't have any impact or a beneficial impact on residents who would be adversely impacted by problems to the pavement. But all of these, we've sort of set ourselves the test of not making a saving if it's going to adversely impact services on residents. So I would hope that there wouldn't be any that would have adverse impacts on protected groups.
No, thank you very much. I think I take your point about the pavement surfacing. I know that's something we talked about in the audit committee, the move from reactive to more kind of planned maintenance of the footways. I think it was more just the idea that I don't know, it seemed very short. I think from the point of view of members of the public reading, it seemed as if there was just a very short line. But I think that the response from Sharon Lee is really, really positive. So that's really great to hear.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the Community Safety Environment PAC who would like to pose a question either on the budget or the relating comments from the officers? Okay, if not, I'm just going to quickly ask before we move on to the next part. I guess this is to Sharon initially. My concern has been that with regards to balancing expenditure versus income, there's a lot of income that I see that, you know, has been curtailed by the pandemic. So things such as parking fees, events, sort of income and so on, which once lost, obviously that's not something we necessarily, that's, you know, that's temporal. So we, you know, that comes in at that time, and once time has passed, it's not coming back. Whereas the costs and the expenditure haven't gone down. And there's not necessarily going to be a bounce back effect as and when the economy opens up. Has that been balanced, do you think, in terms of the other savings that may have been that may have occurred because of the pandemic? I guess just not having my accountant's hat on, I don't see how we have made that loss of income balance.
Chair, I think Emily might help a little bit on this one. As a department, we will obviously have been filling in returns to corporate finance to explain all the income that has been lost, because corporately we will be doing a return to government to try and get back some of that money. And I think it's about 2/3. But Emily, would you please explain? That would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Sharon, you're absolutely right. Councillor Con, there is a government scheme at the moment called the Fees and Charges Compensation Scheme. What that does is takes transactional fees and charges. It doesn't include commercial rental income, but it does include some of those fees and charges, particularly in this department. So events income, parking and traffic management income, in the second part of this meeting, planning income, those sort of transactional fees and charges. The government scheme first requires us to take the hit of the first 5% of the budget ourselves. So what the government says is the council might expect volatility of 5% in those budgets, and we therefore need to bear the first 5% loss of that. After that first 5% loss, we're then reimbursed 75 pence in the pound. So we are receiving government income and government grant, and as Sharon said, the department prepares detailed claims. It's not every month, it's currently on a sort of quarterly basis. And we will then seek for reimbursement on that scheme from government. So it does have a financial impact on us. That each of the departments will bear that first 5% loss, and then that 25p in the pound for every other loss. But there will be a significant grant compensation scheme from government in relation to those fees and charges.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, if I could just add just that extra part then, is that final unfunded part that currently sits in the department as an overspend as a result of COVID. We will be looking at the total impact of COVID on the council at the end of the year. We will then take all of the unring-fenced COVID grant that we have, because we've been given an unring-fenced COVID grant to meet expenditure pressures and residual income pressures. And as far as that covers those losses, we will apply that to those losses. Unfortunately, at the moment, indications are that that grant does not cover all of those losses. So we've currently got a shortfall of at least 2.5 million at this point in time, but still to be worked through, I'm afraid, as we get to the end of March and we see what the changes in restrictions or the lockdown might be.
Okay, thank you. I think I need to go and brush up on what the fees and charges scheme covers. Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Councillor Vaughan, who's going to handle the EHA departmental presentation.
Thank you, Councillor Kwan, for your excellent chairing so far. Rory Vaughan here, the chair of the Economy, Housing and Arts PAC. I believe that we've got a presentation on the budget for the economy, and I understand that I think it's Danny Rochford and Cliff Parker from the finance team in the economy department who are going to lead us on that.
Hi everybody, good evening. So I'm Danny Rochford. I'm Head of Finance for the Economy Department. I'll be doing the presentation this evening. So if you'll just bear with me, my presentation should be popping up on your screen any moment now. At least one of you just let me know if the presentation has popped up on your screen.
We've got it, Danny, I can see it.
It has, yes.
That's good.
Yes, I got this one. Okay, which is rather
excellent.
bizarre. Obviously, environment don't want me to hear my portfolio.
Okay, well, I'm glad everyone has a copy of it up on the screen.
Thank you.
Right. So the plan for next year's budget is for some temporary growth in the budget requirement, together with a programme of savings, which will help us to deal with a range of financial pressures and risks, whilst at the same time delivering and enhancing our frontline services. The budget has been built so that the service can continue to manage the constraints on income collection, which have been largely brought about by the government's programme of welfare reform, delivering temporary accommodation, which prevents and relieves homelessness, whilst protecting the council's financial position, preparing to respond to a potential loss of private sector properties, which will have been exacerbated by loss of jobs during the current COVID-19 crisis. And on the planning side of things, the budget's been built based on developing a commercial approach to non-statutory planning fees, and also maximising other income sources to offset against what we've been witnessing has been a trend of reductions in planning income. Let me know if that's just moved on to the next slide. I think it has now. I'd like to start with a high-level snapshot of the proposed income and expenditure budgets in the economy. So as you can see here, the department provides us a range of services on the general fund side, including temporary accommodation, facilities management, planning, economic development and adult education. The housing solutions budget accounts for over half of the gross spend in our department. It's made up of activities relating to homelessness prevention, assessment and allocations, lettings, maintaining the housing register and temporary accommodation management. In fact, temporary accommodation on its own accounts for more than 20 million of the total spend, and the service recovers around 16 million pounds in income, mostly through housing benefit, but also including flexible homelessness support grants, which is a substantial grant that we receive from central government. You'll notice overall that there is a net budget of about £9 million, and that reflects the financial reality of constraints that we have on income collection and the demand pressures that the service experiences. The operations budget mostly relate to the facilities management function in the council, which was recently brought back in-house. This service largely covers its costs through recharges, and it also includes other budgets such as those for key assets related projects such as the Civic Campus programme. We also have the Economic Development Learning and Skills Service, which is responsible for engaging and supporting local businesses. It provides support for local residents into employment. We're currently involved in a large-scale programme to give discretionary grants to businesses that have been impacted by coronavirus. The planning budgets relate obviously to the cost of providing a planning service, so planning advice, policy, planning assessment, and that service generates just under £4 million a year in fees, or at least that's what the budget expects it to achieve in normal circumstances. There are also some other smaller budgets which largely deal with the revenue impact on the general fund of the council's regeneration and development activities. So all accounted for, that equates to nearly £50 million of expenditure, which includes a savings plan, which is detailed in the next slide. So as I think Emily might have touched upon earlier, just under £7 million of savings are required for the general fund budget for next year, and the economy is going to contribute just over 1 million of that. Officers have worked hard and will continue to work extremely hard to identify and to deliver savings in the current environment. What I've put on the slide is I've listed out the larger ones and then aggregated some of the smaller ones together, but the full detail is in the report, which you will have a copy of. The largest one relates to a review of planning fees and charges with a view to taking a much more commercial approach to recovering costs and charging for our services in the future. And this is expected to generate about 350k next year. We also have the further financial benefit from placing homeless residents into higher quality, longer term private rented sector homes in order to reduce the council's use of expensive temporary accommodation. We also have savings of around 500k when you take them all together to be had from a review of staffing levels, the way that we configure our staffing and funding. And this is expected to come from a number of areas next year, including facilities management, housing solutions, and also economic development. And lastly, we've got a collection of smaller savings, mostly from commercial property budgets. Although officers have been able to find ways to permanently reduce spend, there is a need for some temporary investment. Temporary investment in our services. It's proposed that temporary growth of 1.25 million is provided next year, but this is for 1 year only. Firstly, on planning income, we've observed a trend where planning income has reduced considerably over the last few years, dropping from about 3.4 million in 18-19 to a current forecast of only about 2.2 million for this financial year. So we are currently forecasting to be some £1.5 million short of our income, target for planning fees. Some of this is due to the impact of COVID-19, but planning activity is also highly sensitive to wider economic cycles, the development and construction industries, and in recent years, uncertainty over the economic impact of Brexit. Therefore, based on our current and anticipated income performance, 700k of temporary growth will reduce that £1.5 million income shortfall by around half. The remaining 800 or so will remain as a risk, which will depend on economic conditions post Brexit and potentially post COVID. The other item also requires temporary growth for cost avoidance payments. In the past, we've been able to manage the cost of these cost avoidance payments from existing underspends and from our reserves, but we're not going to be able to do this in future years due to increasing cost pressures. The expected costs of cost avoidance payments next year to private rented sector landlords indicates that we will require about £940,000 of growth. This is based on an assumption that we are going to need to procure about 150 private sector lettings and 350 direct lettings. The good news, which fortunately we have some good news, is that we have recently heard from the spending review that we will be receiving an extra specific grant of about 400,000, which will mean that we won't have to ask for 940k of growth. We will only require 540k. So that's one positive message about the temporary growth requirement. We also have a request for an increase in the inflation which we get on the temporary accommodation contracts that we hold with landlords. The calculation is based on past increases in price, and it equates for this year to about a 3% rise. So although we have needed to build some growth into the budget, I'd like to show you some performance information from my colleagues in economy, which helps to set the context in which we are requesting growth, and it will hopefully allow you to have an insight into the hard work and success that housing officers have had in being able to contain costs and protect the council's reserves. So what you've got here is a graph that shows you how the number of households potentially placed in temporary accommodation has been contained through housing officers' action to place clients into the private rented sector. The accumulated number of PRS by PRS, I'm referring to the private rented sector. Over the 5-year period shown by the red line on the graph, is about 1,100 potential clients, which indicates that temporary accommodation numbers could be double the current 1,175 families that we have in temporary accommodation. So what this graph illustrates is that the strategy has avoided significant extra costs for the council's general fund, which, as we've heard, is currently under significant financial pressure. I'd also like to show you one other graph which shows how our demand pressures from a temporary accommodation perspective have both been mitigated and reduced. The Homelessness Reduction Act was implemented at the start of 2018, and this resulted in additional numbers of homelessness presentations. And although this caused an increase in the number of acceptances to start with, the service mobilised in order to place clients in the into the private rented sector. And although the demand for the service increased substantially, the increase in costs has been contained through being able to put people into the private rented sector. So despite the mitigating management action taken by the council's housing service, the risks facing the economy next year are still quite substantial. So I'd just like to finish off by showing you this slide, which just explains that we have a significant potential for there to be financial impact hitting our department over the course of the coming years. Mainly it's caused by risks that we have in housing solutions to do with potentially the loss of the substantial grants that we get from central government, increases in having to write off some of our debt, further increases in household numbers, and potential further increases in inflationary costs on our temporary accommodation landlord costs. There are a number of other risks in economic development, also in planning, although that risk is only expected for next year and relates to the shortfall in income, which wasn't covered by that temporary growth item that I mentioned earlier. And there's also risks in operations, particularly as a result of having to carry out enhanced cleaning of civic accommodation as a result of coronavirus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roch. Can I members of the EHA PAC to indicate if they'd like to ask questions at this point? I think I've got Councillor Rowbottom and then Councillor Alford. Councillor Rowbottom.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, Danny, for your presentation. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the design review panel. I know that it says in the report that it improves the quality of development. It sounds like an interesting and entrepreneurial additional service. I just wondered if that was the built environment or social dimensions of any development, and specifically whether that has accessibility as one of the quality measures.
There's a limited amount of information that I am going to be able to add to what's already in the report. I'm on that. I understand that it's a discretionary service, but we already use it for our largest schemes, and the idea is to roll it out over a wider audience. I understand that our initial findings are that that is a service that has the potential to take off and therefore yield some extra income for the department. So that is in our savings plan, although next year it's only expected that it might raise a further 20,000. But I can certainly speak to my colleagues in planning to find out some further information and to actually answer your question.
Great, thank you. No, I realise it's there's lots of detail in the report, so you can't be over all of it. But if it could be logged, it would just be very interesting to find out. It's a good commercial revenue. So Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did you have a subsidiary question, supplementary question, Councillor Rowbottom?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Alford. I think you're on mute, Councillor Alford. Councillor Alford, are you with us? I think we've lost you.
Hopefully I'm back, am I?
Yeah.
We can hear you, but we can't see you just at the moment. Oh, that's better. Yeah, excellent.
Hopefully I'm back now. But I'm getting a sign saying I've got poor reception, so I may suddenly disappear again.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, I would like just to raise again the fact we haven't got the housing revenue account, because that does make a difference to this scrutiny panel, because I've not really got another opportunity to scrutinise it publicly. But as it hasn't been printed, I can't scrutinise it. So on that, I will now go on to the homeless budget and the difference between the temporary accommodation and the private sector. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, can hear you loud and clear.
Fine. Sorry, there was a look of blankness and I suddenly thought I was talking to a lovely void. Really, if you could go a little bit more into the homeless budget and the temporary accommodation and the difference really between the temporary accommodation and the private sector leasing. That's really my question, and the risks, because every year we are well aware we're going to get risks, and I thought that we'd entered into some very good arrangements previously. Are these arrangements being discontinued, or are they being continued with the Pan London leasing and things like that?
Okay,
that's the end of my question.
Okay. I think that might be a question better answered by the service, but I can explain that we are looking at we already are part of a Pan London agreement where we are working with other authorities in order to reduce the cost of temporary temporary accommodation. I think in order to talk less about the finances and more about our strategy, that's probably a question for the service.
Mr. Rochford, let me stop you there because I think I've got Councillor Homan and Mark Meehan with their hands up, probably to jump in on this question. So, Councillor Homan or Mark Meehan, do you want to come in on this point?
Could I suggest that Mark Meehan answers this, and if I need to come in afterwards, I will chair, because I think actually, you know, it's very detailed service, it's very complicated, and I think that Mark would be in a better position to explain.
Mark, if you could jump in there.
If I could just say something quickly. Yes, I understand that it's complicated. That's why I'm raising it. But I think I'm probably going to turn my camera off now. We'll only turn it on again when I need to speak, if that's all right, Councillor Vaughan.
Yeah, that's fine, Councillor Alford. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's Mark Meehan here, Chief Housing Officer. You know, I've got my camera off because my reception is bad, obviously, this evening. But to pick up on Councillor Alford's point, we quite rightly we flagged the risks which are flagged in the paper, because there clearly are key risks, always the potential for increasing homelessness. But we do participate in the Pan London scheme called Capital Letters. It is proving successful for Hammersmith and Fulham, and the slide that Danny put up this evening that showed the number of private lettings have been rising, and they have been rising for the last 18 months. So clearly, we hope that success continues with capital letters. We were one of the first boroughs to join the scheme. Happy to share with Council Alford physical numbers of what capital letters is doing for us, but we also retain our own temporary accommodation team that also successfully procure accommodation in the private sector. And what we can provide separately is our temporary accommodation numbers in Hammersmith Fulham have seen a small reduction, which is in the middle of a pandemic, a remarkable achievement, I would say, on behalf of the officers in the homelessness service. We are not complacent, because clearly when the eviction ban, which is currently suspended till February, ends, we don't know what the Prime Minister will decide in February. It may continue, but at some point when the eviction ban ends, there is the possibility, with the current position of the economy, we could see rising homelessness. So that's partly why we flagged the potential risks that we could, despite all the good work being done by Glendine and Shepherd and her team, there's always the possibility that there is rising homelessness. If there's rising homelessness, there is increased costs. The benefit of the private sector is, and we're quite proud of this in Hammersmith Fulham, by not using bed and breakfast, by housing people in the private sector, it is a far better financial for the council than actually putting families in bed and breakfast. So we've got a proud record of not having families in bed and breakfast, and we hope that continues, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Homan, you wanted to add something?
I think a number of the points I would have wanted to, in terms of capital letters, which is a pan-London consortium, if you like, in terms of private station, so that boroughs are not all competing with each other in terms of the rate that you pay, and that's seems to be enormously successful. I mean, we were doing well in Hammersmith and in Fulham before that. You will see from the graphs that Danny showed you, we have been consistently over the last couple of years increasing what we're placing into private rented sector and reducing the temporary accommodation, which is why the budget's looking better. But I really do want to flag the risks, because with the ending of COVID and the potential that suddenly there will be a number of landlords with evictions, that may very well change. We really don't know what the future of housing is going to look like after the pandemic. So I am quite concerned about that. So I think it's right that we actually flag it as a risk. And I think we've also done remarkably well, both through COVID, but before that as well, in terms of our rough sleeping strategy. And I just want to flag that, because this is a part of the housing department that, yes, it's an enormous cost, but actually the officers there work extremely hard to keep that budget under control, but also make sure that people have got a decent roof over their head. And I think, committee needs to kind of recognise that. And I just like to sort of put my thanks to the officers on record, because it's an ever changing situation. And just finally, I think we did talk at the PAC previously in terms of some minor changes to the housing allocations policy. And I think the fact that we are now discharging duty into the private rented sector, but allowing people to stay on the housing register is an incentive for people to accept private rented, which is cheaper than temporary accommodation. So I just wanted to make those points clear. Some people will not be aware of that.
Thank you, Councillor Homan. Councillor Alford, did you want to come back? Sorry, you're on mute, Councillor Alford.
Yeah, I'm not muted now, unfortunately for you. I had one final question, and that was really relating to housing benefit and universal credit. Obviously, there are unfortunately no evictions at the moment, but what is our how reliable do we think that the universal credit is being with assessing and paying people the right amount? Because if it dates into arrears during this COVID, then we will have landlords trying to go for eviction again. And I wondered if we had any idea or any feeling of what was actually happening.
Okay, Mr. Rochford.
Say a few words on that. Yeah, I could. So I could say a few words on that, and then if Mark or perhaps even Councillor Homan wishes to speak afterwards. So I would say that universal credit has been a significant concern for us all ever since its inception. We expected, when universal credit was first implemented, for it to create havoc in terms of our income collection performance. Thankfully, it hasn't been as bad as expected. And from a temporary accommodation perspective, since April 2018, universal credit has been replaced by housing benefit. So all new claims from that point forward have been on housing benefit as opposed to UC, which has been a real positive from our perspective, because it enhances our ability to collect all of the income that is due to us. And if you look at current income collection performance, and this harks back to what Councillor Homan was mentioning a few moments ago, income collection performance at the moment by housing officers is fantastic. It's 99% and upwards. So I think the fact that an increasing number of our temporary accommodation clients are now on housing benefit as opposed to universal credit is actually one of the few good external influences that's impacting on the service at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rochford. Did Mark Meehan or Councillor Homan want to come in on that point? Mark.
No, I just want to add that I thought Danny covered the question really well. We are very good at working with our finance colleagues, in terms of like income collection and making sure we maximise, residents and receipt of housing benefit universal credit. We also work corporately across the council, with our resident benefit beds colleagues as well, and we also work with our private sector landlords. So when we're not working with them in terms of sourcing accommodation in the private sector, we are having that narrative, because clearly, we don't know what will happen, when the pandemic ends. We have that concern that at some point in the future, people may struggle to sustain their homes. So it's in our vested interest across all of Hammersmith and Fulham, to work collaboratively, collegiately, to try and keep many people in their home. That is pure prevention of homelessness.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Homan.
Yeah, I think most of it is being said. In terms of people getting into rent arrears within our own housing stock, that's something that I'm keeping quite a tight check on, and I know that there's lots of support out there, as there is for people in the private rented sector. So if they are getting behind with rent for whatever reason, including housing benefits, then there is support there to try and give them advice, etc. Obviously, we don't know what's going to be the fallout of COVID, and that's the big question. So I think Councillor Alwood's quite right to raise that. Certainly within our own stock, I'm pretty satisfied that we're doing everything we can. We're keeping on top of it during this particular period.
Thank you very much for that. I can't see any further hands up from members of the EHA PAC, so I'll just go on to make a comment myself, and I've got a couple of questions. first of all, thank you very much to all of the officers who've and cabinet members, of course, who've put this budget together. I think, in particular, in the reports, it's pretty well explained what the and in the presentations tonight, it's been pretty well explained what the savings and growth items have been. And I think we've had a rounded conversation about some of that across the general fund for the economy department. So thanks to everyone for the clearly enormously hard work that's gone into preparing this. I won't say anything further about temporary accommodation because I think we have talked about that already. Just to say, obviously, I think it's useful to note that obviously there is this grant that has come in that has reduced some of those costs, but it's good to see there's forward planning in terms of trying to get those private rented sector placements there, such that we would be avoiding costs in the future of over £5 million, according to the report. Interested to know, perhaps in a separate follow-up, maybe either at this PAC or in a separate reply, the effect of, as you mentioned, Councillor Homan, changing the allocations policy to allow people to go into private rented sector accommodation without losing their place on the housing register, which obviously was potentially a disincentive for them to do that before, but without the possibility of going into a slightly longer term private rented sector solution that was probably better all round. And I guess, certainly I've seen that, I'm sure others have seen that in terms of some of the cases that they've dealt with in the past. Just though, two quick questions. So I won't dwell on that, but we may have to come. It would be sensible for us to come back to that in respect of homelessness at a future PAC meeting. Just two questions really on the budget itself. One around the planning fees. There was this issue around commercialisation of planning fees, which is going to raise an extra 350,000 this year. I just wondered. So I have two questions, and maybe Mr. Rochford can come back on this. Is what sort of review have you done to see how realistic it is to get the extra 350,000 as part of planning fees, noting, of course, that there are, there's COVID and other changes. The second question I had was just really on these different management restructures, and if you can just say a little bit more about how those are going to lead to savings and how realistic it is to make those changes. I guess it may have been a question of some of those changes have come through sort of naturally as things have progressed this year. But I wonder if you could just comment on those two things, which is how we're going to get this extra 350,000 and some of these sort of changes that you've bundled together in terms of consolidation of workforce and the like.
Hi, so I can, like some of the other questions that I've been asked, I can only partially answer the question. So in terms of the commercialisation of planning fees, you asked about the work that we'd undertaken in order to ascertain that we would be able to generate an extra £350,000. So that's been through a combination of making sure that we have a robust charging methodology, making sure that when we put together what our costs are, that we understand that we have a mechanism in place to be able to accurately recover those costs, which perhaps we haven't always had that in place in the past. And also we have done a fair bit of benchmarking in order to understand what other authorities are charging and what the potential is for us to vary our charge in order to generate further income. Again, any further detail on that, I can speak to my planning colleagues to come back to you. Councillor Vaughan.
Great, yeah, thanks. Are you able to comment on the other item? I see that Mark Meehan's got his hand up. perhaps Mark, you can comment on that.
Chair, I can cover the other point about management restructure. Yeah, for the benefit of the panel, the way we fund things in housing, and again, we'll make sure that Councillor Alford, as she's raised it earlier, will get a copy of the housing revenue account slides we did for the recent housing revenue residents forum. Is we're partly funded by the general fund, but predominantly funded by the housing revenue account. So the funding for a number of posts are split between the two. So we've already carried out a management review organisation earlier this year, and we've already deleted 2 senior management posts that were partly funded by HRA and general fund. So the figures that Danny has quoted in those slides is a reflection of those posts being deleted.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That's a very helpful explanation. I wonder, actually, given the request to see the housing revenue account, perhaps if you could liaise with Charles and just send them around to the whole of the EHA pack. I think that would cover that off.
Happy to do so.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mark. I think that there aren't any further questions that I can see. So I think I won't sort of summarise everything that we've discussed in that, but I think that there was a good discussion about temporary accommodation in particular, and there are issues that we'll need to come back to at future PAC meetings regarding homelessness. I think as Mark has just undertaken, we will circulate the HRA slides and notes to all members of PAC in due course. So I think it remains for me to, I mean, I think we've heard the comments, and I think we've got some detail there, but I think it remains for me to thank officers for all the work on the budget this year. It's always a tough process, and to hand back to Councillor Kwan to sum up the meeting.
Thank you very much, Councillor Vaughan. Okay, so I wanted to thank everyone, all the officers and all the committee members for accommodating this change of format to the budget, and then from the next set of PAC meetings, we will be going back to our individual PACs and discussing in more detail the policies there. The recommendations from this evening are that the joint policy and accountability committees, the 2 PACs, consider the budget proposals and make recommendations to the Cabinet as appropriate, and that the joint PAC considers the proposed changes to fees and charges and makes recommendations as appropriate. I am going to close the meeting here, and also I'd like to thank anyone who's watching on the live stream. If there are any follow-ups to any of the points raised or questions, I will ask the committee members to direct them either to the chairs or to the coordinators of the PACs for the appropriate follow-up. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and I'd just like to wish everyone to stay healthy and stay safe, and I will see you all at our next individual PAC meetings. Good evening.
Thank you, Chair.
Bye.
Good evening.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.